Have you ever looked at the news and just wondered why the economy feels like such a roller coaster? With these incredible highs and then these really sudden, scary lows. It can feel totally random, right? But what if I told you there's a model, kind of like a diagnostic tool for the entire economy, that economists use to actually make sense of it all? Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to dive in and use this tool to solve the puzzle of our economic world together.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll get our bearings with the big picture framework. Then, we'll pop the hood and look at the two main engines that power the economy, demand and supply. After that, we'll see how those two engines working together or against each other create booms and busts. And finally, we'll get into the really juicy stuff, the huge debate over what, if anything, we should even do about it.
All right, let's get started with that big picture. Because if you want to understand the entire economy, not just one company or one market, but the whole shebang, you need a really powerful framework.
And this is the central mystery we're trying to solve. Why does it feel like we're constantly swinging between times of real growth and prosperity and then these tough periods of recession and job losses? What's actually causing these massive economic shifts?
Well, our primary tool for this investigation is something called the Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply model. You'll see it called the ADAS model for short. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like an EKG for the economy. It shows us how the total demand for everything produced in a country interacts with the total supply of everything. And that single interaction point, well, that determines two of the most important things we track, our total economic output, or GDP, and the average price of everything we buy.
So let's start building this thing by looking at our first piece of the puzzle, the engine of demand. This is all about what gets people, businesses, and governments to spend money.
The aggregate demand curve, or AD curve, basically adds up all the spending in an entire country. We're talking about consumers buying groceries, businesses investing in new equipment, and the government paying for roads and services. It's everyone. But here's the crucial part. It shows us how that grand total of spending goes up or down as the overall price level changes.
So why does it slope down? Why do we spend less when prices are high? Well, it boils down to three main reasons. First, there's the wealth effect. Simple, right? If prices go up, that $100 in your wallet just doesn't go as far, so you feel a little poorer and you buy less. Then there's the interest rate effect. Higher prices mean people need more cash, which can drive up interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses and you to borrow money for big purchases. And finally, the international trade effect. If our prices are higher than other countries, our exports get more expensive for them and their imports look cheaper to us. All three of these things work together to reduce total spending when prices rise.
Okay, theory is one thing, but let's put on our detective hats and apply this to a real-world mystery. Back in the first half of 2015, Canada's economy actually shrank for 2 quarters in a row. That's the technical definition of a recession. So using our AD model, let's see if we can figure out who or what was the culprit. Okay, let's line up the suspects. Suspect number 1, consumer spending. Did Canadians just suddenly stop going to the mall? Well, if you look at the data here, you can see that consumption was actually holding pretty steady right through that period. So nope, it wasn't the shoppers. Suspect 1 is in the clear. What about suspect number 2, the government? Did they slash spending and cause the downturn? Well, looking at this chart, it's actually the opposite. Government spending was on the rise during this time. So far from causing the recession, it was probably helping to soften the blow a little. Suspect 2 is cleared.
And that leaves our final suspect, business investment. And bingo! The culprit was a massive collapse right here. Now, why did that happen? The source material makes it clear. Global oil prices had started to plummet in mid-2014. For a country like Canada, with a big oil sector, that made new investments look like a really bad bet. So businesses hit the brakes on spending, and that dragged the entire aggregate demand curve down with them, triggering that mini recession. Case closed.
Now that we've investigated the demand side of the story, we've got to flip the coin and look at the other engine, supply. This is all about the economy's ability to actually produce all the stuff we want to buy. And this is where things get really interesting because we have to think about supply in 2 different ways. In the long run, an economy's potential is pretty much fixed by things like its technology, its workforce, and its resources. A change in the price level doesn't magically create more factories, so that long-run curve is just a straight vertical line. But in the short run, things are different. The curve actually slopes upward. And the reason for that is because some of the costs of doing business are, well, sticky.
So what on earth do we mean by sticky?
Think about it in the real world. Most of us don't get a pay raise or a pay cut every single day, right? We have contracts or maybe an annual review. Those are sticky wages. And for a restaurant, it literally costs money to print new menus if they want to change their prices. Those are called menu costs. So because of these real-world frictions, if the overall price level goes up, a business can sell its products for more money, but its biggest cost, wages, lags behind. That extra profit tempts them to produce more, and that's why the short-run supply curve slopes up.
Okay, so we have our two main components, demand and supply. Now it's time to put them together on the same graph and see what happens. This is how we can start to explain some of the biggest, most dramatic events in economic history. For example, let's talk about a particularly nasty scenario called stagflation. This is what can happen when you get a negative supply shock. Think about a sudden huge spike in the price of oil that affects almost every business. That shock makes it way more expensive to produce anything, which shifts the short-run supply curve to the left. And the result? It is truly the worst of both worlds. You get a recession with falling output and rising unemployment at the same time as you get higher inflation. Painful.
Now this brings up a massive question. Can an economy just fix itself? Well, according to this model, the answer is yes, but there's a huge catch. In a recession, high unemployment eventually puts downward pressure on wages. As those sticky wages finally come down, business costs fall. That makes firms willing to produce more again, and the short-run supply curve slowly shifts back to the right. The key word in all of that, though, is eventually. This self-correction process can be incredibly slow and painful for the millions of people living through it.
And that slow, painful adjustment period, that leads us straight into our final and maybe most important section, the great economic debate. Because believe it or not, even though most economists use this exact same ADS model, they come to wildly different conclusions about what we should do when the economy goes off the rails. It all boils down to this fundamental question. When the economy is in a slump, should the government and the central bank jump in and try to boost demand to speed up the recovery? Or should they just keep their hands off and trust that slow, painful, self-correcting mechanism to eventually work its magic?
You can think of it like different teams having totally different playbooks. The Keynesian school of thought, which really came out of the Great Depression, says demand is the most important thing, so the government has a duty to actively use spending and taxes to manage it. Then you have monetarists, who argue that the real key to a stable economy is just controlling the money supply. And then there's the new classical school, which says, hey, people are smart, they have rational expectations, so government meddling is often pointless or even harmful. They say we should just focus on having stable, predictable rules and let the market do its thing.
And this is maybe the most crucial takeaway from our source material. There is no final answer here. We have not figured out which school of thought is definitively correct. Economics isn't like physics with these unbreakable laws. It's a living, breathing field of constant debate where all of these different theories are always being tested against a world that never stops changing.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. As we look around at the world today, with all of our unique challenges, from weird inflation to snarled supply chains, which of these playbooks do you think we should be using? The ADAS model gives us a powerful way to see and understand the problem, but figuring out the right solution, well, that's a debate that is very much alive and well.